Hello student, today I am going to take lecture of Advanced Java Unit 6 Hibernate, and topic for this video is Hibernate Architecture. Hibernate architecture is the most important part of Hibernate unit. Overview of Hibernate architecture. There are 4 layers in Hibernate architecture. First layer is Java application layer where we write our Java program. Layer number 2, Hibernate framework layer, which consists of persistent object. Now in Hibernate, persistent object are those objects which are mapped with database. It means such Java object which are mapped with database, that is RDBMS, through Hibernate are known as persistent object. Third layer, backend API layer. Here backend API layer consists of mapping file and configuration file. Fourth layer is database layer. The overview of Hibernate architecture explains that there are 4 layers. One is our Java application, another is persistent object, third is Hibernate mapping file and configuration file, and fourth one is RDBMS. Now block diagram of Hibernate architecture. Here the block diagram represents Java application, persistent object, Hibernate, backend API, which consists of 6 objects starting from configuration, SessionFactory, session object, transaction object, query object, and criteria object. These all are known as core object of Hibernate framework. Next layer is internal API used by Hibernate. The internal API used by Hibernate is JTA, that is Java Transaction API, JDBC, that is Java Database Connectivity, and JNDI, Java Naming and Directory Interface. And the fourth part is database, that is fourth layer. So now explaining Hibernate architecture step by step in detail. So first, internal API used by Hibernate. First is JDBC, Java Database Connectivity, which contains JDBC libraries, which aids Hibernate to communicate our Java application with database. Java Transaction API, which aids database transaction. And JNDI, Java Naming and Directory Interface, which differentiate application programmer with application deployer. So application deployer need not to worry about name of the database, name of the table, and name of the column due to JNDI interface. For creating the first Hibernate application, we must know the objects or elements of Hibernate architecture. So all the elements of Hibernate architecture of backend API are as follows: configuration, session factory, session, transaction factory, query, and criteria. Explaining each of the element in detail. First is configuration. Now here configuration object is the first Hibernate object that we create in Hibernate application. So whenever we'll be starting implementation of an Hibernate application, at that time the first object is to be created is configuration object. It is usually created only once during application initialization. The configuration object provides 2 components. Component number 1, database connection. Database connection is handled through one or more configuration file supported by Hibernate. So we need to communicate our Java object with some database. For that we require 2 files, that is hibernate.properties and hibernate.cfg.xml file for communicating between Java, that is object oriented program, with RDBMS. Second is class mapping setup. This component will create connection between our Java classes and database table. So component number 1 will communicate our object oriented program with our database. For example, if I am using MySQL database, then it will communicate my object oriented program with MySQL database type, and class mapping setup will communicate my Java classes. For example, if I am having Java class named customer, so it will communicate my Java class named customer with RDBMS table customer. Second object is SessionFactory. SessionFactory object is a thread safe, means synchronized object and used by all the threads of an application. The configuration object that we have previously studied is used to create SessionFactory object, which in turn configure Hibernate for an application. So session object is created by configuration object. So first of all, we need to create a configuration object, and then configuration object will create SessionFactory object. Then we would need one SessionFactory object per database using separate configuration file. So if we are using multiple database, then a separate SessionFactory object is required per database. For example, if I am using MySQL database as well as SQL Server database, then I require two SessionFactory object using two separate configuration file, because configuration file stores the setting of database. So if you are using multiple database, then you would have to create multiple SessionFactory objects. Next object is session object. A session is used to get physical connection with database. So session object is a lightweight. The session object is lightweight and designed to be initiated each time an interaction is needed with database. If our Java application is communicating with RDBMS, at that time the session object get initiated each time, and session object is used to track all the activities, that is interaction between our Java application and database is handled by session object. Here the session object should not be kept open for a long time. The reason is they are not usually thread safe, so they are not usually synchronized. Thus, they should be created and destroyed as per they are needed. When you want to initiate communication with a database through Java application, at that time we need to open session object. As soon as we complete our task with a database, then we need to properly close that object. Next object is a transaction object. The name itself explain a transaction represent a unit of work with database. So for example, if I want to fire an insert query from Java application to database, then that thing is known as transaction between Java application and RDBMS. So transaction is unit of work with database, and most of the RDBMS support transaction functionality. Transaction in Hibernate are handled by an underlying transaction manager, for example JTA, and transaction from JDBC or JTA. So JTA is Java Transaction API, which handles transaction between object-oriented program and RDBMS with the help of Java Transaction API. The next object is query object. Query objects use SQL or Hibernate Query Language string to retrieve data from RDBMS and creates its object. For example, when we were working with JDBC, if I want to retrieve any record from database, let's say select star from table name student, then what will happen? That all record will come into result set interface. And now it is task of developer to handle this result set properly to retrieve all the data. While in Hibernate, query object handles all the transaction related to retrieval of data from database and have to create object from that data. So converting RDBMS tuple to objects in Java is handled by query object. A query instance is used to bind query parameter, limit the number of result returned by query, and finally to execute the query. So all the task is being performed by query object in Hibernate architecture. Next object is criteria object. Here criteria object is used to create and execute object oriented criteria query to retrieve the object. So here criteria object will design query which is independent to all the database. Here developer need not to worry about what kind of database we are using in backend. Here criteria object will map the query in such a manner that it would be converted in form of database that we are using in backend. So if I am using MySQL database in backend, criteria object will map that query in form of MySQL format. Well, if I am using SQL server, then it will format my query accordingly. So with this, we complete Hibernate architecture, in which I've explained what is Java application, persistent object that are mapped with database, then backend API of Hibernate, which consists of 6 objects, then JTA, JDBC and JNDI API of Java, and then communicating with database. So this all covers Hibernate architecture. Hibernate architecture is the most important part of Unit 6. So student, prepare it well. Thank you all of you.